Howdy, folks. So this one is going to be a long one. Just warn you right off the bat. Today we are going to go over how to use auth with GraphQL. And there's two, well, I'm hoping that there's another method that we can use that's a little more complicated than this, but I haven't actually tested yet, so we'll have to see. But the main method that they want us to use is a little complicated, and I want to make sure you understand it. So I want to take the time to go over it. Um, so the first thing, though, that we're going to talk about is I want to talk about what's called lazy queries, because I don't think we've covered that yet. So if I go into my schemas here, I have two queries. I have my users query, which takes no parameters and gives users, and then I have the user query, which does take a parameter. Okay, now if I look at my app, I've pretty much only using the users query. And this use query, when you pop the query into it, it just tries to load that immediately, right? And get your data here, loads it immediately. So how do you pass a parameter into it, especially when you don't know what that parameter is at the beginning here? There's not a way you can do it. So what we want to do, first of all, let's just add in our query here. So let's say, oops, we've got to make a new query for it. User query. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to boot up the server and I'm going to let the sandbox create the query for me. Okay, so now I've got my sandbox up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this mutation and just grab the user query. Add that in, all three fields, grab that, pop it in here. All right, and then we can go back up to app. And we're going to import that there. So what we want to do something similar to our use query here, but we have what they call useLazyQuery. Now useLazyQuery is actually very similar to useQuery, except it gives you an array. So it's actually kind of more like use mutation that way. So what we're going to do here is we have our array. We're going to have, just like before, we're going to have a function, okay, that gets called when you want to call this. So similar to how createUser was on the use mutation. So I'm going to call this getUser, and then we have an object that gives us data. And you notice I've got data here, I've got data here. You can't rename these because they're function keys. So what you have to do is you have to use the colon operator to rename like that. useLazyQuery, user query. Okay. And now similar to how we have our users here, user equals user data, user, or null. Because this is not going to be set initially, but once we call this, it'll start setting it. So let's go down here. We'll have a user and div username, or user ID is user.id. All right, so that's something that just lets us know that when this is loaded. Okay, so I'm going to start this up. And that, yeah, just lets us know it's loaded. Then I want to actually put another input field, okay? Text, and I'm actually going to put another, I've got temp name, temp age. I want temp search, or search name, because I want to be able to search for a user by username, right? Because that is what our query does. If we look at our query, it looks for a user by the username. So I need some input for that. So set search name. I'm going to put something very similar to the above one. Value equals search name on change equals set search name e.target.value. And then we'll put a button, search, and then what that button is going to do, okay, click, is we're going to call our function, getUser, and very similar to how we called createUser with the variables, we're going to call getUser, variables, username, search name. All right. So we put that in there. Let's open it up. Okay, not the prettiest interface. All right, so then if I search for Sam, okay, search, and now you can see that user ID populates. The network query that was made calls now query user with username Sam. So that's just a quick overview of how we handle queries with parameters. Or if you have a query that you want to run more than once because you know you've updated data, you can use lazyQuery and it gives you a function that you can just continuously call whenever you want to load it. All right, so let's take a look now at how to do authentication. So the first thing is I've added, if you look in here, I've added an auth middleware or function for just signing JWT data, right? We've got JSON web token in here. We got our data, returning JWT.sign. We're getting the key from our env here. All right. So first of all, how do we do a login? Well, what I'm going to do, I'm not actually going to add a password onto our user. I'm just going to put a hard-coded one because I don't want to change this too much. But basically, in our type defs, login is considered a mutation. And the idea is because you're creating some data, you're creating a token, it's a mutation. It could easily be a query as well. I personally would put it as a query, but I've seen it in examples as a mutation. So we're going to say login, username, string, password, string. And this returns auth, which is a new type. What is auth? Well, auth is going to be, first of all, a user, which is the user that you logged in as, and then the token as a string. Oh, without the quotes. You need this token because this is how we're actually passing the token back up to GraphQL to handle. Okay? So we pass the token in here. We say, okay, here's your token. Here's your auth. That's how we do it. So we got our username, password, we got our auth, we got our token, etc. Now, let's add that mutation in here. Async parent, username, password as the arguments. So the first thing we want to do is get a hold of that user. And so I'm going to say user equals user.find one username. If not user, well, our auth doesn't really give us the ability to return failure, right? So maybe we actually put like a success as a Boolean on there. Nope, it doesn't like Boolean. Boolean. There we go. So not Boolean. This is not uncommon for non-REST-based APIs to be able to return a flag that indicates if it was successful. And that's so. Let's go here and let's say, okay, return success false. And it should be okay with that because we haven't indicated that user or token are actually required. So the success should be okay. In fact, maybe we make the success required. We also could say if the user and token are null, that indicates failure, but yeah, sometimes it's better this way so you can return a message as well. Okay, so if we have no user, then that's fine. Then I'm just not going to do a password check at this point. This is where you do your password check normally and do bcrypt. I don't want to take the time to do that or store the password or set that up. So, assuming we got past our password check, the next thing we want to do is make the token. And so I'm going to, let's see, const. This is going to be sign require utils auth. So I'm going to assign the JWT token. The object I'm going to put in is basically the user ID. User.id, because that's really all we need to identify the user. Okay? Once we've signed that, our result is going to be success true token. I think I called it token. Yes, I did. And then the user is going to be, well, just our user. All right, let's give that a whirl in our sandbox and let's see what we get. All right, so I want to go back here. I want to take this out. I want to do mutation login. Okay, and then my username is going to be here. My password just doesn't matter. And I say yes, I want this and the token. I don't, well, if I say I want the user, I could say give me the user ID, sure. We run that. Ooh, cannot return null for non-nullable field auth success. Doesn't like that. Oh, because I misspelled it. Oops, misspelled it again. There we go. That's fun. There we go. Success true. Here is our auth, our token, our JWT token, and here is our user ID. Cool. So we know that works. Let's actually pull these other things in here. Let's grab this mutation, and then let's put it into our client. Export const login user equals GQL, and we'll pop that in here. Mutation, username, password, login user. So what I want to do here is I want to rearrange a little bit of this because we're no longer creating users. We're going to be doing some login stuff. Okay, so now we've got, our app has changed a little bit. We've got a logged in state. If we're not logged in, we open the login pane, which has a specific callback, which tells us when we're logged in, sets the login. If we are logged in, we go to home. Pretty simple, right? Home is basically empty. We'll fill that later. Login. We've got a pretty normal login form, username, password. They set their temporary variables. And then on click, we've got our button that does something. So what do we want to do? Well, we want it to actually log in. We've got our login user mutation here that we already set up, so let's import that. This is going to be in utils mutations. All right, and then let's import use mutation from Apollo. Okay, then we got to set up our do login error equals use mutation login user. So now we've got that all set up. Let's just do error if there is an error. We'll just show that to the user. Now down here, okay, I'm going to say we get some data. Actually, this is going to be await data equals do login variables. Let's see, this needs to be that. And then we have our username, temp name, and our password, temp pass. And that's that. So then, let's see what data we get back. Okay, because we need to do something with this data when it comes back. Okay, so I go here. I'm going to log in as Sam. Undefined. I must be forgetting something because the response definitely has some data in there. You know what it is? I forgot to await. I bet that's it. This is an async function. I forgot to await it. All right, let's try that again. No. No, thank you, LastPass. I don't want that. There we go. Now we get some data. Login, success true, token, user. Cool. So what we're going to do is I'm going to say, okay, we can actually spread this even further into login as data. That might be a little complicated. Actually, I think I can do, yeah, like this. So then this actually pulls out login into data, which is kind of more what I'm looking for. No. Oh, read and login. Nope, I guess that doesn't work the way I wanted it to. Never mind. So let's see here. Our token is going to be data.login.token. Our success is going to be data.login.success. If success, we should probably only continue if we were successful. right? So we get our token here. Now what are we going to do with our token? Well, and if you had an error, if you weren't successful at this point, it would be a good way to set your error message here and have some error stuff. What we want to do is we want to store this somewhere. And normally with REST, we store this in a cookie. We can't do that here because we don't really have the best access to cookies. And we want to store it in local storage for reasons because we can use it later very easily. So local storage dot set item login token, and then we're going to do login. And that's just that callback up here that will actually trigger the system to know, oh, on login, not do login. There we go. On login. Good thing I checked. This should not be user, this should be data. Okay. So now, let's try that. Sam, no, please go away. Any password, login, cannot read success. I probably screwed up the data again. I think I've got something wrong with that. So let's just see what we get. Here, login. It is login, right? Oh, it's lowercase login. That's what I got wrong. Okay. Sometimes it's hard to tell with the font that shows up in console logs. It's hard to tell if it's an upper or lowercase. Anyway, okay. Now, you can see we go to home because we changed that state. And let's take a look at our local storage. There's our login token. Beautiful. So we've got login token now. We've got the ability to log in, handle that, all that stuff. So what do we do with that? Well, first off, we want to actually log in by default. So if, let's see, local storage dot get item token, if token is not equal to null, or actually just if token set logged in true. This is this just says, hey, when I load the component for the first time, when I enter the app for the first time, I'm not going to know that I'm logged in. So instead, find if I have this item, this token at all, just log me in by default. So now, if I load this, oh, use effect is not defined. Okay. Let's pull that in from React. Did you see it flash the login screen for a second, then went to home? We'll do that again. Oh, now it just goes to home. It's quicker. So now it just knows, okay, we're going to home because we have the login token. Well, that's great. Now let's actually do something with our login token. Let's add another query. Not here. Let's add a query to the server. And let's call it me. What's that going to do? That's going to tell me what user I am. It's going to return the user ID that my login token belongs to. Seems pretty useful, right? If I call me, well, I need to have a login token. I need to have that set up. So there's a couple different steps we need here. The first step we need is actually passing that login token down with a GraphQL request. So that's, if we go to our client now, let's take a look at our index where we set up the Apollo client. Okay, so what we want to do here is we want to actually change this immensely, unfortunately. We're going to pull in, create HTTP link. So this is a special and set, oops, no, not that, I guess. And then what we're going to do, we're going to make our server, right? Our server is still there. It's good. But now I'm actually going to specifically create HTTP link. And then I'm going to pass that in here. Now, this, if you pass in a string here, it basically does the same thing. It calls create HTTP link. So this isn't that different. Okay. What comes next, though, is going to be a little different. So now what we're going to do, we're going to import set context. Now, this comes from Apollo client link context, kind of a long trail. Set context specifically is going to be a function that lets us set the context of the request. So remember in our Express days, we had the request and the response. Apollo has context, and that's what they call it. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull in this function, okay? And then I'll explain to you what it does. So what this is doing, first of all, this is the wrong one, login token. So the first thing it does is it goes and it grabs the login token, okay? And it says, let's grab this login token from localStorage. Then it changes the headers, and you can see in here we've got our parameters where we're ignoring the first one, that the underscore often indicates an ignore in this case. We're getting the headers from the context in this case being the request. And we're returning a new context, spreading the old headers, but we're adding an authorization header. Authorization headers are a way, if you aren't using cookies, this is the next common way of handling sending a token like this. Bearer token. And bearer tokens are also a common type of token. Don't worry about that too much. Basically, this is just a format that the backend needs to know about in order to know how to handle this token. So we got our token, we're getting it from local storage, and we're adding it as an authorization header. Then in here, what we have to do is we say, okay, we've got our HTTP link. We are going to concatenate them. Authlink.concat HTTP link. And what this does is basically it sets up this particular function and this auth link as an object. So rather than a URI that's just a string like we had before with our GraphQL, now there's a special object that Apollo client is going to call every time it needs to figure out where to send stuff, and that is the way we've set it up because we've got our context here. It's going to actually set the authorization header. Complicated? Yeah. Very complicated, but just remember this code basically sets the authorization header, and you have to tell Apollo client to use it like this. So what I want to do now is I want to actually just call that me endpoint, okay? And just so we can see what it does. So export const me query GQL. Once again, I'm going to go to our sandbox, back up to the root, down to the query. We're going to grab the me, and I'm going to grab that query there. Okay, pop that in there. Let's go back to our home because we want to call this from home. Import me query from utils queries, and then we have to import useQuery from Apollo client. And then just at the top here, we're going to add our data and loading equals useQuery me query. All right. So this will probably fail because we haven't set any of it up appropriately. But now if I go here and I look at my network tab, let's reload this. Oh, that's not right. That should definitely not be hidden object. Let's take a look at this then. Let's see here. So we look at our index here. So this is no longer URI actually. So URI Apollo client is still treating it as a string. We need to change that to link so that it knows that this is a more complicated object. All right, so now we got a 504 gateway timeout. That is probably because, yeah, let's restart this. It was behaving for a little while. All right, now that that's restarted, let's reload this. All right, we got our GraphQL. And now if we look, here's our payload, here's our me, our response is null because we haven't set anything up. Now if I look at the headers, in the request headers you see this authorization bearer. That's our token. That's the token that we've sent. That's our local storage token in the authorization header. This is great because this means that now we're sending that token down to the server, which means we can utilize that token on the server to figure stuff out. Okay, so let's go to our server. Now, what we're going to need to do here is similar to us changing context on the front, on the Apollo client. We're going to need to do the same thing on the back end. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to create, in our auth, we're going to create a middleware, and we're going to call this the auth middleware. Now, middleware in GraphQL is a little different. It applies to every request individually. This is different from Express, where in Express, middleware applied to each individual route. GraphQL doesn't do that because it's not technically actually middleware. It's more saying here's the context of the request. We're kind of co-opting that. So this will apply to every route or every request we make. And so what we want to do, I'm just going to paste in this really long thing, and then I'll explain to you what it means. Hello, kitty. All right. Oops, not this part. And let's re-indent this. No. All right. So what is this doing now? The first thing that this does is it's getting a request. And this should look familiar. This is actually an Express request because GraphQL uses Express. That was how we set it up, was we set it up to use Express. So it has the Express request. So what we're doing is we're looking for the authorization token in a number of places. Okay. So you could send it via the body, you could send it via the query, or you could send it via your authorization. This is not uncommon because if you're allowing a token to be sent somewhere that's not cookie, you could do it in a number of different places just for convenience of your client. In our particular case, we are sending it as a header, the authorization header. So this is going to be the header's authorization. This should be token. Now we split it. Why do we split it? Well, let's take a look at our bearer token, what it looks like again. This is the word bearer, a space, and then the token. Now, normally what you would be doing here is you'd actually be validating your bearer. So instead of this pop trim, you would be saying, okay, split list, and then I would say type equals list 0, and const token, token equals list 1. And then I would say if type is not equal to bearer some error here, because the client has sent us a format of authentication that we don't know how to handle. The reason for this, there are multiple ways you can use the authorization header. There is username, password, there's bearer, there's a couple other different types of tokens you can pass, and so you want to make sure you're getting the right one, because otherwise it may be in a format you're not expecting. But anyway, that's what that does. That basically says if we've got a token, split it out, verify its type, and basically get the actual value. Dot trim. Trim just takes white space off the ends because JWT verify can handle white space very well. These lines are kind of interesting. If we were doing an express thing, we would not have these lines. We would have instead, if there's no token at this point, we throw a 401, right? Remember, GraphQL does not work that way. In GraphQL, you have to, this will be called for every single query, including login. So basically, if we don't have a token, we just continue on. We just say, okay, fine, we're just continuing, we're going forward. And that's just going to have to be that, which means we have to do the check for authentication in the resolver. We cannot do it in the middleware here. So if the token can be verified, we basically just attempt to verify and we say, okay, let's try to get our data. In this case, I know it's going to be user ID, right? And I'm going to change this to user ID. Similar to what we were doing with the Express middleware, we could just add stuff onto the request, and that's totally fine. In this case, this secret, I'm going to change this to be process m JWT key. And then I'm actually going to take off the mask age because I didn't set that initially. So this is basically verifying the JWT token, getting that data, sending it on here. Otherwise, we just log that there was an invalid token and continue. And then we return the request object. All right. Sounds good so far. Now, what's the other piece of this? Now that we have this auth middleware, we have to set it up. So we're actually going to import that in here. Const auth middleware require utils auth. Then when we create our Apollo server, we're going to set it as the context, like that. What that is basically going to do is that's basically going to tell Apollo server, hey, whenever you need to get the context for every request, call this function, which we've set up already as getting that data. The next thing is in the actual resolvers. So we've got our me resolver, okay? So let's actually create the query for that. Me async parent. Now, here's the fun part. We don't have any params, so we're just going to say args, but we don't have any. The third parameter to any resolver that includes mutations or queries is the context. And what is the context? Well, it's what we just set in here. Return the request object so it can be passed to resolver as the context. This gives us the context. So whatever we get here becomes our context. So in our resolver here, let's just console log the context, okay? Just to start off with. And what I want to do then is I want to reload this page, just so we make that GraphQL request. And now you can see bunch of long stuff, but this is essentially the express request. But what we expect is we should be getting a user ID. So let's take a look at that. Let's see if we get a user ID on here. Reload this again. GraphQL goes through. There's our user ID. And that is the object ID of the user that we need to grab. So what I'm going to say, if not context.userID, return null, because we're not authenticated. If we don't have a user ID on our context, we have no authentication, which means we should just return null to, probably want to throw an error in that case, but GraphQL is not amazing with like 401s and stuff, so maybe you want to send like a specific response that has an error in it or something. But right now I'm just going to return null. So if I'm not logged in, so if I go into here, run this query, it gives me null because I haven't given it, I don't have the authentication set in the sandbox. However, if we do have the user ID, what we want to do is we want to do kind of something similar to this, right? We want to return user.find where the ID is context.userID. But we need to convert it to an object ID first because Mongoose does not like having a string as an ID. It needs an object ID. So we're going to import that. Mongoose equals require mongoose. And I'm just going to convert this mongoose.types.object ID. Now that converts it into an object ID so that Mongoose will appropriately search by the ID. Now I run this. I look at GraphQL here and I look at the response. Oops. Oh, it gives me an error. Object ID cannot be invoked without new. Okay. New. Oh, now it just gives me, now it gave me a whole proxy error. Okay, this has to restart. Okay, now that that's restarted, let's go back up here, refresh, GraphQL, and now we can see there's my me. Username, age, type name, and ID. So that is how you use a JWT key with this system. And so basically you have to set up a ton of stuff. You have to set up this context here, right? With this auth middleware, all that stuff. You have to set up the actual auth middleware to go and grab this token. I mean, this is not unusual because we had to do this for Express as well. But you get your token. It's a little bit different because it's actually a bearer token, not a cookie. In your front end, you have to handle this whole set context to actually add the token into the system. And then you have to actually make sure you put it into local storage. So that is the desired accepted way to handle authentication. It is very finicky, and you have to do it very specifically in this way and all these pieces, or else nothing really works. I was going to go over the second way, which I think is going to be a little less complicated, but this is already 34 minutes, and that's quite long. So maybe I'll do that as a follow-up video. Anyway, I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you all next time.